Coming up, people in India rush to emergency care during 40-plus degree weather. Heat surpassed only by Pakistan, which swelters in 50-degree heat. New studies follow our wind and solar energy track record and the inequalities that stymie any real progress in the global south.
You describe a so-called uneven playing field in the renewable sector. What do you mean by that?
These fossil fuels which we are consuming are highly subsidized.
And a country known for its vast renewables infrastructure is in murky waters. Norway announces an interest to tap into lithium and cobalt reserves under the ocean floor. Scientists and activists say the process could mean the end for local underwater ecosystems.
This is an area the size of the UK, which we don't know all that much about.
Just 2 degrees is on now.
Are you suggesting that this impact assessment was not comprehensively done or possibly even rigged?
Yes.
It was so hot in Pakistan in May. The temperature gauge peaked at 52 degrees Celsius in one province. For anyone having to be outdoors, it was a living hell, really. Many of us can barely withstand temperatures in the 30s, but over 50, unthinkable. And make no mistake, those temperatures are not normal in Pakistan.
Islamabad in late May. Lush green vegetation transformed into a hellish landscape. And behind, the world's 5th largest mosque, the Faisal. The fires surprisingly didn't do much to deter daily offerings and prayers, and the Faisal Mosque was undamaged. But in other parts of the country, hundreds were rushed to the emergency room.
So जो पहले एक आध पेशेंट था, वो 15-20 पेशेंट से लेकर 30-40 पेशेंट डेली आना शुरू हो गए हैं, जिनको कुछ को इब्तदाई अलामात होती हैं, जस्ट फीवर है, हेडेक है, और जो क्लासिकल हीट स्ट्रोक के पेशेंट हैं, वो भी रिपोर्ट होना शुरू हो गए हैं.
The government was quick to issue warnings to the pregnant and elderly to steer clear of direct sunlight. People were advised to remain indoors and hydrate to avoid feelings of nausea, heat stroke, or worse. That wasn't an option for Muhammad, seen here on shift, building a house in Pakistan's second largest city, Lahore. A serious concern for his industry, construction workers suffer through heat waves and often do not report their symptoms for fear of reprisal.
बस डर कैसे था मजदूरी करनी है पानी पी लिया ठंडा तो काम शुरू कर लिया अपना क्या करे गरीबी मजदूरी तो करनी पड़ती है.
And as is the case with heat waves, a surge in demand for electricity and the resulting power outages. In Karachi and Peshawar, local media reported that people blocked roads in protest.
सक्कर के हमारे हुक्मरान एमपी एमएनए उनके घरों में तो जनरेटर एसियां हैं जो हम वोट देते हैं उसके बावजूद भी हम खुद ही जलील होते हैं. हम क्या कर सकते हैं, गरीब आवाम यही कर सकती है, पानी का सहारा लेके टाइम पास कर लेती है.
In addition to heat waves, Pakistan faces other climate hazards: melting glaciers, droughts, desertification, and flooding. The nation saw its worst in 2022 that killed close to 2,000 people and left a third of the country underwater.
हमारा पैटर्न बदल गया. कभी बहुत सख्त सर्दी आ जाती है, कभी बहुत सख्त गर्मी आ जाती है, कभी बारिशें बहुत ज़्यादा आ जाती हैं, कभी ड्राउट आ जाता है. तो so this is called climate change. तो ये climate change के साथ heat wave का बहुत ज़्यादा ताल्लुक है.
In May, temperatures rose to 8 degrees Celsius above the average over the last 20 years. And if the trend stays the course, this weather promises more instability and hospitalizations throughout the year.
Pakistan always at the top of the list of the countries which are most vulnerable to climate change. So that is partially related to the geographical location where Pakistan is, because Pakistan comes at the termination of the monsoon. So the monsoon starts from Bay of Bengal, and after passing through the whole subcontinent, it terminates over Pakistan. And then we have like western disturbances starting from Mediterranean, also terminating over Pakistan in the northern part during the winter season. So any changes in the termination point because of the location of Pakistan makes it very vulnerable. It makes the country very vulnerable because any small spatial changes will lead to the impact over the country in terms of higher amount of precipitation or the lower amount of precipitation. So at both the ends. So what happened in 2022 that during the spring season, it was just 2 years ago, we were having a record-breaking temperatures in Pakistan. There was a heat wave in the months of April and May, and it was record-breaking. And after 2 years, in the months of April and up till mid of May, we were having flooding kind of flooding condition. The temperature were really low, so it was just opposite to the case of 2022. But in the later half of May, it was the switch of the weather was so sudden that within 10 days we were experiencing the heat wave in Pakistan. So weather was switched very quickly. So it was just within 10 days, and you can imagine that such kind of changes in weather will be very vulnerable. It makes the poorest of the poor, the farmers, very vulnerable because they cannot plan their harvest, and sometimes they cannot could bring their produce to the markets. So they face a lot of problems, and also almost 40 to 45% of the labor force of the country is associated with agriculture. So it has multiple effects going from one point to another, and it cascades through the value chain as well. Currently, we are at 1.2 degrees centigrade warmer than the pre-industrial world. So I give you an example of 2022. For that particular heat wave, we also did a study called climate change attribution. So we attributed that how much that heat wave was exacerbated due to climate change. And in that study, we saw a big footprint of climate change in exacerbating that impact. And later on in 2022, we also had a flooding event, the record-breaking flooding event in Pakistan, which incurred losses of 30 billion. And again, we did a study and we also found the strong footprint of climate change exacerbating that particular flooding. So as a scientist working in the field for the last 20 years, I'm convinced that the climate change is responsible in exacerbating. If we do the assessment, we'll again find that climate change has a role in worsening these weather patterns over the country. So the first thing I would say is to do mitigation, is to stop the emissions of greenhouse gases dead in its track. So the long-term temperature goal of the Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees centigrade. But we are experiencing losses of like 30 billion, in the range of 30 billion, which equates the total exports of the country, of the annual exports of the country. So these kind of losses we are experiencing at temperature of 1.2 degrees centigrade. So the things will definitely worsen at 1.5 degrees centigrade, but anything beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade, it'll be just a death sentence if you consider the heat wave and the way the temperatures are rising.
Let me just cut in there for a second, Doctor. You earlier talked about Pakistan's geography. Why would there be 50-something plus degrees Celsius temperatures there?
There's a index we call wet bulb temperature, and which is a combination of heat and humidity. So it is not only the heat you're talking about. So you're mentioning 50 plus temperature in Pakistan, but if you add humidity factor to it, so it is just we are talking about the threshold of physiological threshold where the humidity cannot survive. So 35 degrees centigrade wet bulb temperature is considered as a threshold. And in Pakistan, it has been surpassed multiple times. And we have witnessed deaths, fatalities because of this wet bulb temperature. And again, I'll relate it to the point which I've said earlier. So all these things or these impacts are happening at a global warming of 1.2 degrees centigrade. Anything, and we are heading to a 1.5, and anything beyond 1.5, it will be intolerable for the people, or it will put a lot of pressure in on the resources of the country as well.
People in India too had to deal with a punishing heat wave, this one in June. temperatures in the north and west of the country soared well above 45 degrees Celsius.
और गर्मी इतनी ज़्यादा है कि किसी बच्चे को चक्कर आ रहे हैं, किसी को कुछ हो रहा है, किसी को कुछ हो रहा है, किसी को डिहाइड्रेशन हो रही है, तो इस चक्कर में बच्चों का इतना ज़्यादा बुरा हाल है.
Emergency rooms overflowed with patients seeking relief from heat exhaustion. At the time of this report, there are at least 100 confirmed deaths linked to the weather, with an additional 25,000 suffering from heat stroke. In the Vivekanand camp near New Delhi's affluent diplomatic enclave, residents lined up for water for hours.
So some of the patients were drowsy and they needed ventilator, and some of the patients had convulsions also, and one patient came gasping also to the emergency department.
Heat waves are particularly problematic if they last for a longer period of time, in addition to the intensity. So usually the first day of extreme heat is a problem for human health, but especially the second and later days of extreme heat are additionally difficult, because then the human body doesn't have time to recuperate as an extreme heat period extends. And what we anticipate is that as warming continues worldwide, but particularly in this region, these summertime periods of extreme heat waves will become more frequent and also more intense, and also will be longer lasting.
Well, the heat in Asia is a stark reminder of the peril we're all facing, and just how much further we need to go to avoid a worsening crisis. Well, a new report is giving insight on the state of global renewable energy. REN 21, a network of scientists, governments, NGOs, and renewable energy industry agents, has published the latest edition of its Global Renewable Status Report. The group has been tracking renewable energy targets, policies, and progress since the year 2005. The new report includes the latest details and insights on the successes and challenges involved, giving us a big picture view of how far we have and haven't come with renewables.
So basically, the recent study is looking specifically at renewable energy in the demand sectors, so in buildings, industry, transport, and agriculture. And unfortunately, we see here that we don't stand in a very good space, I guess. When we're looking at the overall energy demand, renewable makes out 12.7% basically of the total demand, or total energy we consume. So the largest part is still fossil fuel. And I think what we see as an alerting space is that we had basically, in response to the energy crisis and also geopolitical, but also COVID, really an uptake of energy consumers and also governments really fostering not only the supply of renewables, but also the fact that we use more renewable energy. And today we see that only 13 countries have implemented renewable energy policies in all 4 end-use sectors. So buildings, agriculture, industry, and transport. And this is very worrying, because the transition needs to happen by investing in renewable energy capacities to provide the supply, but also ensuring that we're basically consuming and using renewable energy.
According to your report, I think only 12 or 13 countries, the UK, the US, a few EU countries, China, Egypt, India included, had implemented renewable energy policies in those sectors you talked about, including transport and agriculture. For example, by the end of last year, you describe a so-called uneven playing field in the renewable sector. What do you mean by that?
So there is very clearly an uneven playing field, because we see those sectors when we're looking into building, industry, and transport that make the major consumption. They will not consume power, so electricity, but they are going to consume heat and fuels. And these are highly dependent on fossil fuels. And these fossil fuels which we are consuming are highly subsidized. They remain, basically, we still see globally, these are the most recent numbers, in 2022, fossil fuel were subsidized at the level of $7 trillion, 11 million US dollars per minute. And I think this is very clearly reinforcing or is not creating the level playing field that is required for renewable energy. And what we also see is that basically the economic, since the fossil fuel price went down, energy consumers are not are basically going back to some of their historic consumption patterns, and to really change those consumption patterns, governments need to step up in the phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, but also supporting basically the use of renewables. So that's a level playing field that is missing.
When you look at the global south, obviously there's great demand in renewables in the agriculture sector. But according to the International Energy Agency, I was reading, solar power, wind energy dominate countries' ambitions, while hydropower, bioenergy, and other renewables tend to be overlooked. Why do you think that is?
So I think this is very clearly, so from Renewable one side, always pointed out this disconnect in policy design. So there has been a massive focus on the power sector, so developing renewable power, which is in particular wind and PV. But developing renewable fuels or developing renewable heat has been disregarded more. So I think something like 100 countries have a renewable power target, whereas you'd only have around 60 countries that would have policies for fuels, for instance, and if I recall, so 30 countries has gone up from 20 to 30 for renewable energy in buildings. This is one component. As a result of this focus on power, basically, we have seen over the last years massive technology developments and reduced costs in solar PV and wind in particular, which is really encouraging because it shows that as a result of good policies, we also have good technologies and good market conditions. So I think this is what is very inspiring about it. Now, the disadvantage of it is that some other technologies that are really important, however, when we are looking into the overall energy system, which is moving away from a fossil fuel-based system to a renewable-based system, need to complement basically solar PV and wind with, for instance, storage technologies, the development of grids, but also other type of renewables that will bring like hydropower or biopower or geothermal power, as you mentioned, that can basically very well complement the more variable production of solar PV and wind. That's one part. But the other part also, really the renewable energy technology that will directly provide heat and fuel. So solar thermal, for instance, has been disregarded more. Even though today we clearly see that technology developments, and we have an upcoming report that will be published in 2 weeks' time, specifically on the supply side and the development of renewable markets, but where we very clearly see that these technologies are important because they can actually drive the transition, not only power transition, but an overall energy transition, and also really bring the demand sides together. So a demand for power and demand for heat can be interconnected very easily. A demand for mobility, when we're thinking about electric mobility, can be directly connected to power.
Earlier this year, Norway said it was looking into opening up more than 250,000 square kilometers of its territorial waters to the mining industry, but would only do so if an impact assessment proved that deep-sea mining could be done with little to no environmental consequences. But the country has since decided to permit mining for critical raw materials like cobalt and lithium, both of which are used in electric cars, by the way, a rapidly growing industry. It's important to note that these minerals are also used to produce solar panels and wind turbines, which suggests they're essential in the global transition away from fossil fuels. That said, Norway's decision has received fierce local and EU opposition.
So here in Norway, we have had quite a short process, an opening of the deep sea for deep sea bed mining. They have done that without the proper and adequate impact assessment on how an activity was actually, which consequences it will have for the environment. And so part of the process, when you're opening up a new area for activity here in Norway, you have to do a proper consequence impact assessment to know the consequences of a new activity. And what we are stating, the Norwegian government hasn't done so.
So then, are you suggesting that this impact assessment was not comprehensively done or possibly even rigged?
Yes, that's correct. Part of the process is the own Directorate for Environment, which is the kind of government body here in Norway, who's looking at the impact on the environment, and said quite clearly that there hasn't enough information. We don't have the data available to know the potential impact for deep sea bed mining. So this is an area the size of the UK, which we don't know all that much about. So 99% of the area we don't have data on. It hasn't been looked at kind of what lives there, what's the marine ecosystem, and so on. So you can't do a proper impact assessment and knowing the impact of the activity because we actually haven't done the proper assessment of knowing what the status of the marine ecosystem is.
Well, why doesn't the WWF have this information? Has the government denied this information to you?
So the government has part of the process is saying, acknowledging in the white paper, which is the part of the opening process, are stating that we don't have enough information about this area. We need to know more. But at the same time, they assess that, well, we can do this in a good way anyhow, without knowing even if the potential impact on the environment. They're just in a way dismissing their own advice and just saying we want to open. That's more important for us than doing the proper and adequate impact assessment.
There's a conundrum here, Karoline. The government says it wants to mine cobalt and lithium. Both are instrumental for the renewable sector. So then, but has the government then exhausted other options?
Absolutely not. And I think this showcased the general dilemma we are in, because we do need renewable energy and we need it faster than we are currently doing and phasing out fossil fuel. But we also need an incentives to much more recirculate and the different minerals that we already have extracted. There's almost no incentive globally to actually recirculate the rare minerals, which we should do before we extract new ones. We do need the minerals now. So the deep sea bed minerals, even if it's doable, which we don't know yet, won't be able before maybe 15 years. And we need the minerals for the green shift now. So what we have to look at is both kind of how can we recirculate, recycle the minerals that we have, getting that into the value chain, but then also looking to how we can do responsible mining on land, both across Europe.
I want to talk briefly about the lawsuit in a second, but is there, you think, for WWF, a compromise here, where because these minerals are so important for renewables, yet there's a possible damage to the environment? Is there a compromise where the government and activists can meet in the middle and minimize as much as possible the seabed damage?
I would say at the current stage, we have asked for a moratorium to not go for exploration of deep sea bed minerals because we need to know the potential impact on the environment. So we have to start in the right order. So until we get that from the Norwegian government and other countries who wants to do deep sea bed mining, we have to do the proper job and understanding the consequences first. And I think that's what's surprising a lot of kind of international stakeholders as well, is kind of the hasty process that we have in Norway, and that we go about and be doing this extractive industry without knowing the consequences for a really unique and fragile ecosystem that we have way up in the Arctic. And the resistance that we see, for example, in Europe, and then with the EU resolution from the EU Parliament on being caution, having a precautionary approach, the input that we get from international scientists on this, the community is saying understand more of the life in the deep sea.
So on this lawsuit, if the WWF has not had access to the impact assessment that the government has done, what is your strongest argument for winning this lawsuit against them?
Well, we have said when we are now taking the Norwegian government to court is that we have laws and regulation in Norway that you have to do a proper and adequate impact assessments when you're opening up a new area for new activity. You need to know the consequences. That has been clearly stated through the process that hasn't been done because of the lack of the data, the lack of knowledge that we have about the deep sea. So it's a government body who states that in the process, and there is no impact assessments available because it hasn't been done. So we are then claiming that the whole process has been flawed and it's not legally done correct. And therefore, you can't open up a new area the size of UK for deep sea bed mining.
We reached out to Norway's government, but officials declined an interview. They did issue us a statement, however, saying they were committed to knowledge-based ocean management that balances conservation and the sustainable use of ocean resources, adding that seabed mineral extraction could have significant future market potential. And we end our show with tornadoes. The first week of June saw several touch down across the U.S., killing a 2-year-old boy when a house collapsed in Michigan and injured several people trapped after another structure collapsed in Maryland. There were also tornadoes in Ohio and Texas.